Okay, so I'll formally say welcome to the Emergence talk. Most of you know that I talk about emergence a lot, both as an event and also as part of a larger body of my model in what I call the field of emergence or the field of existence. So you'll hear me reference that as I speak today. In general, I talk about the expansive field of existence, the creative body that is natural to us, is what we are, and is a kind of physics and consciousness that comes into contact with this other consciousness that I generally refer to as the adaptive body. And in emergence, specifically, what gets hit is the field of existence in its expansive, fast-moving, dynamic quality. And what it hits up against is the restrictive body and consciousness of the adaptive body or adaptive field. And this adaptive body is not just within you, it is also this larger body that we all live and exist or try to exist within. It is the body that gives birth to all of systemic oppression. It is a body that is predicated and grounded in control as the agency of power. And it deeply believes itself to be right. This is a piece that's really important, is that you can't talk it out of its position. It has known itself as a source of power and collected power for many, many, many generations. And it has formed adaptations because of the lack of connection with other more organic forms of power. So you'll hear me touch on all of those pieces today. What I want to start out by saying is that emergence is natural and that it is part of the maturation process that we are all in as humans. That we have these kind of events or periods in our life where we experience something that is larger than us and something that comes from the field that is unconditioned. It is before conditioning. And that when we experience those things, it is interruptive to the ways that we frame reality, the ways that we interact with reality, and the ways that we believe reality to have certain attributes. It is meant to be disruptive, and the way that we incorporate that disruption, the process of integration, is actually a process of uniting two seemingly disparate bodies into one alchemized, integrated whole. Ideally, that process takes you through your own particularities of learning and rabbit holes that are akin to your conditioning, your history, your family's history, and some of your particular fate journey. That process of going through that intense alchemical transformation is where most people get really stuck. And part of the reason why they get really stuck there is because we don't have a lot of models that talk about these two bodies, their interplay, and the precedence for the predominance of the adaptive body in every single aspect of what we touch or are not touched by. So there's something to understand here about these two bodies and how they behave. So the first thing that I'll say, which I started with, is that they have different physics. And what I mean by that is not just different frequencies, but different ways of actually moving. So when those two bodies are very close to each other, you will experience something called flickering. which is where you will go back and forth between these different states of consciousness, and you will actually perceive and see through your eyes differently within each of those bodies. When emergence happens, if it is intense, you will experience a lot of flickering. And if somebody doesn't tell you what flickering is, it will be likely that you will think you are losing your mind, because your perception will be so altered and ungrounded by its transformative state between those two bodies. Because we live in systems of control and domination everywhere around us, and because the currency in systems of control and domination is leveraging power and love against you, and because that is done through something called a double bind, which is like a no-win situation, where you will be pulled into a kind of futile freeze that not only you will know, but your ancestors will have known. So it will have been transmitted to you in the womb as a possibility in your system, even if you had great parents who were very nurturing. This is not about somebody being assholes. That can play into it, but that's not the only thing that's here. So because we have this inside of us, there's times where that presencing of the double bind will be very alive in us. And when it is, we will see our situation as being choiceless and ourself as being stuck. When we are in that stuckness for long enough, it becomes recursive in its patterning. And that recursiveness becomes chronic or pathological. Okay, so I'm going to go back and just say a little bit about the attributes of the two bodies. So in the adaptive body, there is a consciousness that believes that power comes from a kind of agency born from and within control. It very much believes in selfhood as the agent. That's very different from the field of existence or the emergent body. That body understands that power is actually not individual, but is part of a unified field of consciousness, and that is ecosystemic in nature. The attribute of that field understands that if I help you to be in power, I will also be in more power. Not as a source of generosity or kindness, but as an understanding about the intricate interconnectedness that we all share. And that if any one piece of that interconnectedness is off, even by a degree, everything will be in a kind of distortion. This is true at a micro sense in you from a wholeness perspective, and it is also true in a meta sense in everybody you come into contact with and who contacts you. The existence field's intelligence just knows this. Okay, other differences. In the adaptive body, it is very, very concerned about relationality and belonging as a kind of currency. It wants to earn love. It wants to keep love. It wants to appear in a positive light. It wants to be liked. It wants to say the right thing. It wants to quantify its own existence. In the existence field, it does not give a shit about any of those things. Like literally, I always say the thing about Cesar Millan, the dog trainer. For those of you who know Cesar Millan, the dog trainer, if you don't know, this is the biggest thing that I think is important that he says, which is that humans try to train dogs as other humans. Dogs don't function as humans. The field of divine power doesn't really care if you live or die. It doesn't really care if anybody likes you or if you're alone or if you're hot or ugly. It doesn't care about any of those things. Its only care or its only move is its own evolution. It is only concerned with creating and destroying. It will destroy the things that are out of right alignment with honesty, and it will create from that honesty. One more thing I want to say about the difference between the two fields, the diversifier between them, is that in the adaptive body, it has learned through response to trauma or harm or loss. It is learned through death and loss, and it has adapted to that. The existence field doesn't care about death. In fact, death is its back pocket. It knows and lives from death as much as it knows and lives from vitality. There is no separation in that field. Its intelligence is way bigger and larger than the human consciousness. Its capacity for possibility is much bigger and larger than human consciousness. So as a result, we feel incredibly threatened by it. And when we come into contact with its frequency and vibration, those around us feel incredibly threatened by us. And we may not be doing anything wrong, but we feel this in a kind of resonance. Essentially, what it does is it takes no prisoners until it gets stripped bare of anything that is dishonest. That is the only point of emergence. If there is an enlightenment, that's it. There's no like other planet that you're going to get delivered onto. And it is a process, and there's no shortcutting the process. But there is a way that this process is getting deeply hampered in our society because we have so much domination as the consciousness. And so much scarcity has come from that domination that we have this collective desperation for love and belonging. In addition, when you encounter emergence, you will encounter a field that is so much bigger and more powerful than you, that if your commodification of love has not been sufficient before then, you will feel that absence 20-fold. And we don't have societies or situations where that love is supporting as a bridge. So we see a lot of people tripping in this process because of that. And then they're blaming themselves for not doing enough with the process. But really, part of it is we're not set up for this. In addition, I just want to say this too. If you are a person who experienced emergence as a result of drinking ayahuasca, taking a mega dose of psychedelics, and that emergence wound up to be big time disruptive to you, it is also because in some ways, when you open yourself up to that larger consciousness, it isn't all love and light that's there. So we have this fantasy that like we have trauma and we're going to go expand into these places that are unconditioned. And we have this narrative that says, well, that's the divine. And that the divine somehow we think is like just really sparkly and pretty. But the reality is like massive evil exists there too. And so do lots of other colonizing energies that are not in human bodies and are in human bodies. And so we become open to these things, and we have this preponderance of innocence because divinity by nature is innocence, not child innocence, but mature innocence. That's a very different thing. There's a willingness that shows up in there, and kind of a love texture that is present that will often make us very vulnerable. After I experienced this last experience with Emergence back in 2015, I was hunting for a few books to help me. And I stumbled upon this one book that some of you may know. It's like a question and answer book by Adyashanti, where people they've collected many of his lecture questions and answers about coming back after emergence. And in one of them, he talks about how if you thought you knew what was going to happen before emergence, everybody who he has spoken to after emergence has said, I never had a clue. It's basically the same as having a child. People are like, I'm ready. I know what's going to happen when I have a kid. Then they have a kid and they're like, oh, I'm not ready and I was wrong. It's a whole other set of conditions. So what I'm hoping for today by way of this introduction is to create this kind of town hall experience for you guys, where you get to ask me and I get to talk a little bit about the very many variances that show up in emergence, both in the adaptive body and its way of clamping down and deceiving us into following what it thinks is the right thing, and from the emergent body, which is not happening to you once, but once that floodgate gets opened, is continually running through you. And the nature of trying to live within that continual running through you, because that requires its own change of your life in order to be in confluence with it and not get sick from it. Yeah, it's a good question. So for me, I think about commodification of love as basically being a kind of distilling of the body of love so that there's enough currency. It's kind of like if love has been withheld for most of your formative experience, or it has somehow gone through the adaptive body so strongly that it is distorted. It doesn't mean it's not there, but it's hard to contact, or you have to work to contact it. It means that the availability of love is very spread out. There's a kind of way that I've noticed that if there's enough love, it kind of gets packaged, like not really, but within us, we have this resource of context or like touch points towards it. And if we have that, we seem to do a little bit better in emergence. I mean, it also, I'll just add this piece too, which is that this is part of what I'm measuring in the chronic study, because I've been watching it for a long time, which is that the presence of what I call relational existence, which is connected to the body of enough love, like a threshold within there, that the presence of enough relational existence seems to set people up where there's a difference during emergence. And it totally makes sense when you think about it, but no one seems to be measuring this. I think that the answer to that is the same in some ways, which is that I think that what I know happens during emergence and the integration of emergence is that your energy and consciousness shifts gradually and sometimes suddenly from the adaptive body into the more emergent or existence field. Now, just because the consciousness shifts there and the amount or percentage shifts there doesn't mean that your buy-in is still there. And I think this lag that we experience, or this period of integration, or at least this is what I've witnessed in probably about 500 people, maybe 300 people now, is that this lag or integration is about getting all of you more on board, more like in yielding or in compliance in some ways with the larger consciousness. And that takes time physically in your physical body for it to receive it and hold it. It also takes time in the somatic body and the energy body, and it takes time in your situation. Like you may have to make changes to your situation in order for that to be okay. But what I have seen is that over time, the predominance of you will begin to live in the field of emergence. And it doesn't mean the adaptive body is gone or can't get really tapped into, but it's like you don't buy it anymore. It's kind of like all of its tricks no longer have much of a hold on you. And the last place of holdout usually has to do with these primary places of control, the places that are so, so deep within us around how we have been controlled, how we have felt out of control, how we have been exploited and used, and how we have exploited and used others. There's something really, really deep in us about that remembering that does not go quickly. But it's really two different consciousness or intelligences kind of co-creating and beginning to respect each other. And part of what happens is that you are collapsing. If you're trying to do anything, it is the bringing attention and awareness to the places where control and domination and victimization are alive in you, and you are actively trying to see through them and collapse those structures. What happens there is then chi is released to be more free in the system and then become integrated into the intelligence of emergence.
Yeah, okay, that's phenomenal. Thank you.
In my work and in some of my clearings, I work with something that I call the central pulse. And that central pulse I have witnessed, and I just want to say here that what I should always say this, I try to, which is that whatever I'm teaching is what I know till now. And so it may be a week from now, I may know something different. So I'm going to give you the best of what I know and the most honest part of what I know. So there is this unified pulse that I have experienced and experience all the time, and a lot of my clearings incorporate. And what it seems to do is it harmonizes many of the other places where we have a pulse, or what I call a nodal point. So I don't know how familiar you are with Kundalini. Okay. So in a Kundalini process, one of the hallmarks of that, besides all of the gesturing and the kriyas that you can go through, which is the glamorized part of it and the sucky part of it, but one of the things that happens is that energy finds all of the repositories that are what I would say is entangled in places that are not yet free chi. They're kind of still in those knots, and it will go after those knots. I have found that this centralized pulse does the same. And once you awaken it, it systemically moves from one place to another, basically touching different points. And it has its own intelligence about it. If it is greatly restricted, it will have another kind of consequence. Do you know what I mean? But if you are able to respect its intelligence, what I have seen is that it has patterns that it goes through. And you don't even need to track them, but you could try. And those patterns seem to have some sort of sequencing that has to do with unearthing whatever needs to be unearthed. When I meet with people individually, sometimes I can tune into that part of the field and I can see the sequence. And so I will literally touch them in that sequence. I don't know what that sequence is. When I'm in person with people, it can be on the body too. And it can be as random as like it wants me to touch their left big toe. And then it wants me to touch their forehead. And I'm like, I don't know what that's about. Seems totally illogical, but there's something about the networking to it that it knows, and it does something that we don't see. And so that is when I listen to you, that's what I sense is happening. And my sense is that you're still so in the thick of it, like it's rapidly moving through you, which I just want to say is so hard. Or I experience that as being very painful because it's so unreliable. You're in such an unstable place. But there is a kind of global stability to it as well, which is that it's running through your system to reorganize you in some sort of way. Most of the modalities that are out there are too narrow to meet the complexity of what happens in a complex emergence. So if there is the presencing of like a Kundalini experience, plus some people have psychosis, some people have like, channeling that comes, right? There's like all of these things that can be present. One of the things that happens is that we try to find a frame or a modality that will fit all of those things, and they all kind of fail. And I mean, I experienced this myself too many times over. But I think this is what I'm trying to do, is equip people with a model that is bigger than a modality and will help you kind of navigate understanding where you are, so that your feeling of agency increases, even if you still have kind of no agency, like even if it's still running through you. Some of it is that our relationship to it really changes through this process. Most of us start from a place where we think that even if we're surrendered or yielding in our life, that like we think we're equipped with that, but we've never experienced this kind of helplessness or destruction, or chaos. And so we have to kind of have a rearranging of the way that we relate to it. And that is part of the intelligence of the process as well. The way I usually think about flickering is when you are going back and forth between not just emotional states, but states of consciousness. And it could be true that that's some of what's happening for you too, is that it's not just the emotional state, but it is actually a different consciousness that's present. It can also happen with time, depending on whether time is a factor of awakening for us. For some people, it is more dominant than others. I mean, for about 8 years, I experienced myself as completely being what I would say out of time. And I'm still not in time, but it's very different now than it was then. And so there's a kind of like the flickering between states usually is experienced as like your view changes, like your state of being changes, and the whole thing, you're looking through a completely different field. In the beginning of emergence, this really happens because there's a different consciousness that now is pollinating your body and your being. And so the flickering might be very, very fast and very, very disruptive. Ideally, over time, your consciousness is starting to move more into that matured body, and you're maturing with it. And so there's not quite as much disruptive flickering. I always refer to this stuff as like seasons. I lived in Vermont for 20 years. And like, in Vermont, winter is the whole, it's Vermont. Vermont is like winter. But, you like move into summer. And when summer moves into fall and fall really begins to move into winter, you experience this place where there's this tension between the two. And it's like you can almost feel them like fighting till winter becomes dominant. And there's something about that tension and that kind of like liminal changeover that we experience through the entire period of becoming that is emergence, until we've kind of more arrived wherever we're going. The other thing I'll say about that is there's no arrival in emergence. So there's a forever deepening, which means that you also become adapted and acclimated to a kind of liminality as truth, not as temporal. So I think about time as being a variable in the way that we relate and perceive to reality, within reality. And it is a major variable because all of our consensus reality obviously is organized within a certain linear adaptation or projection of time as a real thing. I think in a lot of emergence, we lose time, or time becomes elastic or transparent or less of a variable because we are making contact with a body that has not ever been bound by time. It's outside and larger than time. Some people would also say it's outside and larger than space, and that is for sure true too. But I find that people are usually more disrupted by the time variable than the space one in general. It's very disruptive to not be in time. It really makes everything complicated. Yeah. I mean, there are definitely those tricks, like wearing a watch, setting alarms, things like that. But the emergent body, it wants to give birth and like have a sexual experience when it wants to have a sexual experience. And this is part of the challenge with emergence as well, which is that you are emerging into a body that by nature is the erotic. It's not the like fun, let's go take a tantric course on the erotic. This is like the real erotic. And the real erotic is kind of unstoppable creation. And so it takes no prisoners. And when it wants to create, it wants to create. And if those variables and the context for that creation are not present, you will suffer. And you may not be able to produce those variables. So it's tricky. This is another piece of it that is really, really tricky. It's kind of like when you open up the whole cosmos, are you ready for how that cosmos is going to dance with consensus reality, which is basically this big a slice of the cosmos, maybe even narrower, but it thinks it's the whole thing. It narcissistically believes it's the cosmos, when in fact, it's not even close to the cosmos, and you're not going to convince it otherwise. It's like a bad dictator. And so this is part of why it's really tricky to navigate that. Yeah. In response to what you're saying, it's funny. I had that feeling after my last emergence where my face was like melting. And I was like, oh, it's like being on LSD, which I had never taken, but I had heard about. And I kept thinking it was going to like, it was going to end. I was like, oh, I'm going to just be in an altered state through this Kundalini experience, and then I'm going to be normal again. But little did I know that I was going to still be some sort of altered state rocket ship like forever and ever. But I think like the thing is that reality is real reality is always flickering. So real reality is always in motion. And in fact, when you drop into deep, deep stillness, if you go through and underneath that stillness, what you find is the vibration of the motion of the stillness. And so, when we see that, when it is open to us and we perceive that, it really messes with our nervous system, which has a hard time acclimating to that dose or that kind of like disruption. We are matter, and this is coming way above and beyond matter. And so I wanted to say that, and also just say that I think one of the things that happens after these events or repeated events is that we go to the systems that we have thinking that we need more healing. And we do it because this is what we have kind of available to us. And for some people, many people I've spoken to, they've gone to the hospital, having these big eruptive events. And unfortunately, what they're receiving in response to that need for healing is actually trying to shut down what the emergence is trying to do. And because we have so little respect and deep understanding for the way that real intelligence knows how to self-organize, and that self-organizing process needs a kind of care and love for a period of time so that it can find its own way, we just keep disrupting it over and over again. And unfortunately, then people become more like fractured in the process. And so I think we need more understanding about the nature of these things and more respect for them and more time to really allow them to show us what they are doing, rather than moving in and assuming that we know what they are doing and that we have a better, more authority answer. And this requires a kind of humility that obviously is not baked into the current medical system or payer systems either, which, is its own problem. But I think it's important to just know it even within yourself. Is like there's something here that knows what to do. And you might not be able to sort its voice at the beginning, and it might be hard to know the different voices or presences that are there, but that it gets clearer over time. Yeah. Every time I come across the adaptive body in somebody who is in the experience of transformation, whether from emergence or just life, the nature of the adaptive body is that there is a huge fear layer with it, and that it's clinging and hold on the structure of reality and life is unyielding. It does not want to give up its position. It thinks that its position is a position of authority and of agency. It does not understand that actually there's a bigger agency piece there. And this includes even people who are brought up in very religious households and have had lots of experiences with divinity. It doesn't leave that out either. There's a whole conditioning here that is separate and also sometimes in religious traditions.
So if you're having that experience, that's like quite dominant in your experience, that that sense of like that kind of this is everything, that would you say that's kind of the adaptive body dominating your sense of self at that moment?
I would say that is the adaptive body believing that it is yourself, that is the only self that you have, and that it is the primary, most important self, and that the preservation of that self is tantamount importance.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing about this is that in emergence, you do give up that self. I mean, that's why emergence is so scary and disruptive, is like that self is basically being torn apart. And if you're having a shamanic emergence on top of it, the tearing apart comes with a lot of indoctrination as well into other realms and other ways of being pulled apart and other tests. So, losing ourself is kind of glamorized in the like neo like spiritual world of today, but the truth of the matter is it's really, really hard, and we also never really lose that self. And it's okay. It's just that this other larger, what I don't call self, but I call more aesthetic tone and frequency, that is what we are. It is the diversified version of ourself from the larger consciousness that kind of begins to absorb this smaller self, and then they work in kind of tandem together. I was going to say something else too, which is that okay, I'll go to those. Okay. I was going to say something else too today about like what's happening in the US presidential election. So I know it's kind of funny, but I, have been watching this through my own lens. And this is not a political view, but it is a systemic view, which is that in essence, for quite a while now, we have been fed only the formulaic, right? That is largely what comes from the adaptive body, is this kind of formulaic, colonized version of life. It's like, oh, if you like this, we'll give you 10 of this, right? That's why there's 10 targets on 3 blocks. So it's kind of like, if we know you like this thing, we'll make sure that you keep replicating it. And this is some of the job of the adaptive body. But what has happened is in the presencing of that, what has been exiled is the creative body that comes from the more existence fields. And that has created a culture and a world that is deeply starved. I would never have understood this if I had not cut my teeth on severe anorexia for 20 years. But working with that, those systems taught me this about this larger piece, which is that collectively we are all very hungry and we are all very desperate. So interestingly, when you're hungry and desperate, one of the things that you want is disruption. And even if that disruption comes in a package that looks like it is deeply flawed, we'll still choose it over what we perceive to be the formulaic, because we're hungry for something that is not so safe. So even if it is a replication version, not the authentic version of power that is disruptive, like Kali, we will still take it because it seems better than staying stuck where we are. And that is part of what is showing up in the field. So forget about the election, but understand that there is a tension between the formulaic and the emergent or the creative. And that tension is always going to be pulling in both directions. And that there's something to the alchemy of when it goes too far in one direction or the other, where obviously then a kind of homeostasis is trying to correct itself. But the set point, threshold, and homeostasis that we have adapted to is too low. We have adapted to not getting enough. And so we're screaming for more, and no one wants to hear it. That's a whole other trailhead. But I just wanted to say that. If you have questions about that, feel free to ask. There's a couple things I will say in response to that. One is that it's not infrequent to lose the presence of guides or guidance in this process. So it's not unusual. People are like, I had this full team that I had relationship to in the spirit world, and suddenly it's like crickets. So that is not unusual. There's something about like going into what I call the woods, and like you have to figure out the path. And like everything that shows up that looks like it's going to help you or rescue you, you're screwed, because it's either a lie or it's going to fall apart. Because this is another piece that I understand about the nature of emergence, which is that it's job or aim, those aren't exactly the right words, but I don't know what else to use, is to individuate you into your own resonant consciousness. And so there's a process of this that really is about tearing you away from anything that would assist you in a direction that maybe you'd have to figure out for yourself. This is like the ultimate non-codependency. It's like there are fractals of codependency, from human relationship to inner relationship to familial relationship to like larger with guides kind of relationship that like you can emerge out of. And when you're there, there's nothing to help you. And you can try all the things. I mean, I must have spent $20,000 in the first 2 years of my emergence that I did not have, while people were stealing money from me at my business so that I could try and get help. And none of that ever, I was teaching them, like literally, I was teaching them. And so there's something here that really happens about you finding your way. And I have learned that there is always guidance, and that learning the discernment of trust is really learning the different frequencies. And if you have ever meditated before, you will know that like, you get really good at sensing where the mind is producing a thought versus when a concept kind of emerges from the larger field. You can feel that it's very different. And so there's this same kind of process that can happen in the discernment of emergence, where you can keep distilling into a better place with understanding that. The last thing I want to say too about that, which I recorded a talk earlier that included emergence, and it should come out soon. But I said this in that talk too, which is that there can be what she referred to as a lot of red herrings, which means like stuff can show up and it looks like the thing, or like you think it's the thing, the beacon to follow, and then you find that like it actually was a false path. And I think that that is part of this process of distillation that emergence is about, where like the universe is kind of reflecting certain aspects of you or your consciousness, and you're learning like which bowling pins to knock down, basically. And it can be really frustrating, because if you were anything like me before this last version of emergence, I mean, I like pretty much knew what to do in my life. Like I was really capable and really successful. And it like completely obliterated all of that. And so it took some time to really orient to a completely different way of being with both consensus reality and the unified field. And that's what you're doing here. You're learning a new relationship to all of those things. In that place of nothing, are you creating? Are you writing? Keep doing it. Don't worry about it. Whatever you can't keep up with, it'll come back. It'll keep the process in motion. And that's what you really want to do, is keep the process in motion. This is the most impactful thing you can do. For me, I was a single mom to a child who was, and I had a big business when I emerged, but all of those things apprehended a certain degree of motion, and I suffered. I was in the hell realms a lot because of that for a lot longer than was ideal. But if you can stay in motion, this process will keep moving through you. Let me just look at the chat real quick. And then Erin, yes, is there anything in the chat, you guys, that I missed that I need to answer?
There's one question: what is shamanic emergence?
So I would say shamanic emergence is just an emergence that you have that also contains some shamanic elements. So shamanic elements usually come with a kind of shamanic dismembering, which is where you get put through certain tests, or you get taken to certain worlds or realms, and you experience what is happening in those worlds or realms, and you learn to navigate different worlds and realms, so that ideally you can be a weaver that goes beyond and outside of time. Not everybody has that variable with emergence, and it is its own sort of challenge. Lots of people die in that part of emergence. For a long time, I was sure I was going to die in my emergence or not live very long after it. It's the restoration of permission, right? It's the restoration of permission to act, permission to follow that authority that is not this dictatorship authority, but is more the inner authority. and permission to super mess up, like to really get it wrong, to follow that pulse and then find out that like, oh my God, that wasn't the pulse, or like maybe it was, but it didn't happen, or it wasn't what you thought. But this permission to really make art that looks like shit half the time and know that it's still art. And that is really what this is. Your life becomes an interweaving of art making. And you have to then begin to behave and think like an artist and understand that all of those same pieces that happen with artists, erotic frustration, blue balls, right? All these things that happen with artists, needing the right context for your art. If it's not painting, maybe it's writing, maybe it's sound, that there's a piece of this that matters so much after emergence that is not as important beforehand, because the adaptive body is, before emergence, the adaptive body still has learned to navigate the larger reality and make it work for them. Unless you're born a high-level creative, and that's its own other tangent, then the adaptive body has never really worked for you, and you've always wanted to just get back to making art, and society is killing you with its oppression and its lack of paying you enough. But that's a whole other story. So the play question, play becomes central, as does art, the more consciousness is rooted in the eternal or the existence body, because the nature of that body is experimentation and play. Like that's just the nature of the thing itself. What's interesting is that before that, when consciousness is more rooted in the adaptive body, it will take time to make art, or it will go to an art class, or it will take time to play. It still believes that there's a compartment for that privilege. Once you get past that, there's no compartment for it. All of life becomes that. Literally, all of life becomes a possibility for you to play with it. And you will begin to play with it, because you will understand that, in fact, the limits of possibility that you thought were there before are a lie. So this is the thing, is that play and art making becomes the only thing that you do, and it may not appear like that at all. So I always say it's play, it's art making, and it's sex. That's all I'm ever doing, is having sex, playing, and art making. And when I can't do those things with somebody that I'm with, I leave, or I try to leave, because I'm bored and antsy, and then I start feeling like shit. Because it's no longer like there's nothing there for me. It's empty. And it's hard. It's actually really hard to be that person, because people don't understand it, and they don't like it, and they think you're an asshole. And actually, you're kind of the nicest thing in the room. They just don't have the lens for it. I'll just say that, I think for a while, we used discernment to understand the difference between those two bodies and the presence of them. But when enough time has gone on and enough integration, it really is just the aliveness we're paying attention to, more than needing to discern between the flickering. And what you begin to notice is that the aliveness, it wants to play with others. So once you move into a very ecosystemic field, it doesn't want to play with others anymore because it's wounded from abandonment. Now it wants to play with others because it's full with itself. And the possibilities for co-creation become endless, even if it's an argument between you and somebody else. The other thing I want you to know about that is that this same variable I'm speaking about is also present way before any of this is happening. And if you come to my talk next week on addiction, you're going to hear me talk about what the erotic body does in the throes of addiction. And it's this. It's that the erotic body, or the creative body, will move its energy and try to create an experience for itself, regardless of the conditions, even if those conditions are harming. That probably isn't the direction that we thought we were going to go in with that answer, but that's my answer to that. I love that question. It's such an intriguing question. I'll tell you what I think. I don't know the answer to that, but I'll tell you what I think, which is that I think that prophecy comes from a different channel than the predictive body does. And I think that prophecy, I know that prophecy does not always come true, because we are always within more choice than we recognize. And variance within choice actually affects the creation of the future. And I don't really believe, and have not yet experienced, that there's that many things that are so set in stone that like they will definitely happen to us. This really, really speaks to the fact that when we really understand it, we are constantly flooded with possibilities for what we might choose and how we might move. And that most of our moves and choices are not really ours at all. They're coming from deeply entrained bodies that kind of run us. And I don't mean colonizing bodies in a bad way, but just that we have these habitual patterns and limits that we generally implicitly cooperate with and stay within. And breaking those particular intrinsic bodies is very difficult and requires what I call an original or organic move. And I will talk about that more next week, because it more connects to the recursiveness of chronic addiction and chronic patterning, but that there's a kind of velocity to an original move that disrupts the consensus reality even within yourself. So yeah, that's what I'll say about that. And I think prophecy is really interesting and fascinating. And I don't know that much about it, just my own experience and some of what I've learned, but I'd love to know more about how it cooperates with this piece of predictiveness. You know, the predictiveness that comes from the adaptive body is really coming from an anxiousness and a desire to control reality, which is very different from a prophecy. Yeah. Yeah. So the answer to that is that sometimes we have to use the adaptive body in order to make ourselves safe or secure finances or situations, because otherwise there will be something potentially catastrophic, or it will affect others around us that are dependent on us or that we don't want to affect. And there is a way to actually use the adaptive body in the service of the existence field, but sometimes it's a little further down the line than where we're at. So I don't know if this is true for this person or not. You know, it's a little like understanding that we don't live in an emergence or an existence friendly culture in any country, really. And that we are always kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul in order to try and keep things afloat to a certain extent. Sometimes we do that for a while in order to get closer to what we want to experience. And then we find that we have to give that up too. So I'll just say this part, which is that very much the erotic likes an edge. So it likes the edges. It likes to change states, and it likes to experience itself as becoming something else, sometimes very frequently. And so as you go down this path, the tolerance for giving the erotic a replication becomes less and less. But there are times where you can still kind of do that and get away with it. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really great question, and pretty much what happens to most of us is that we have this emergence that's present, and the external container is not friendly towards it, doesn't understand it, and actually wants to shut it down. And so that, again, there are places where you can kind of negotiate with that sometimes, but you have to look at the cost of that negotiation. So you're kind of always doing this cost benefit analysis through this process, where you're looking at the cost of like giving up a job versus like mitigating the discomfort in the job, where there can be a negotiation, or where you actually just have to release yourself from it. I want to say this too, which is that most of the time we think we need to get out of it more than is true. And at the beginning of emergence, we generally feel the most uncomfortable because emergence is very hot. And so at that time, we're most likely to like fire our family and our like, you know, job and like the place that we live, because everything is in flux and in chaos, and suddenly nothing fits anymore. So it's kind of that, you know, age-old story of like we emerge and then we leave to India and we go become a monk or something. And then like 4 years later, we're like, oh, wait, that wasn't actually like so needed, but you couldn't see it until it was in the rearview mirror.